Hey everybody, it's Miss Cochran. I just wanted to talk to you about close reading and poetry. I know that poetry can be intimidating at times, and so this is a really good resource that Purdue OWL has put out. Purdue OWL is a part of Purdue University, and they are a fabulous resource. It's one of the few I use outside of like what we already have textbook wise. And it's very reliable and they address a lot of information. So definitely go check out their website. If you ever need help with MLA formatting or APA formatting, they are the place to go. It's where I send every student outside of the textbook, but it's where I send every student and it's never failed me. So the idea here is that I'm just going to try to help you guys understand how to do a close reading of a poem. There's going to be 5 main steps that kind of talk about the poetic craft. So mode / genre, form, line, language, all those kind of ideas to help you out. So sometimes you're going to be in a literature course, or really any course. It could happen in psychology, sociology, history, anything. And your instructor might ask you to perform a close reading. If you're going to have to write an essay based off a close reading, what they're really wanting you to do is perform a careful, sustained analysis of any text that focuses on significant details or patterns, and that typically examines some aspect of the text form, craft, meaning, etc. So before you can obviously do a close reading, you have to choose what you're reading. Normally that's assigned to you, but sometimes they'll say, pick a poem from the Romantic period and perform a close reading. So just make sure you know what you're choosing before you try to dive in. So different instructors have different reasons for asking their students to do a close reading, but here are some of the most common. If you're reading a text closely, you may pay more attention to how the writer is using language and the creative ways in which language can work the page. So that's dealing with rhetoric, which is very important. Rhetoric is key to all aspects of life, not just academic or English related. However, a lot of times we're asking you to do a close reading to better understand and appreciate a text, both it's how it's crafted and its significance, so what it means. And then you also may find yourself interested in a pattern you notice throughout the text, a motif, a repeating idea. And by exploring it, you can learn about how a writer crafts their work and how they are communicating with us. So those last two tie in together pretty well. But ultimately, it's important to do close readings because when you learn how something's written, how it's crafted, that can impact your writing. So by breaking down how someone is speaking or writing, you can become better at speaking or writing even when you don't realize it. So it's really a great tool. So when you're reading a poem, you want to read it carefully. Obviously, you should always read it carefully, even if you're not writing an essay on it. So here's some quick tips for you. Just know that not all poems are narratives, so you might have to approach them a little bit differently. It would be great if everything was always a story and we just had to follow the plot, but alas, 'tis not so. So first, read the poem slowly. When you read quickly and just skim, you can miss things. A poem is written in such a way that everything they include is important. Read the poem more than once. I suggest you read any piece of literature you have to analyze more than once because you read it once for comprehension and 2+ to really pick it apart. If you give yourself extra time to notice things, you can really dig in and understand the meaning without having to rely on others. Read it aloud. It's often helpful when you hear a poem read aloud, even though not all of them are really well suited for that, and we'll see something like that. But when you read it aloud, you can hear the rhythm maybe, and what we'll see with Keats, as an example, he has a very melodic, melody-based writing, and it's pretty beautiful to hear. And then you also want to annotate the text, mark things, significant words, phrases, recurring images, line breaks, anything that seems interesting or unusual. You can write your reactions or question in the margins, highlight things, underline. If you look at mine, like if there's a word I don't know and it's not defined by the anthology, I have my definitions right out the side. I have exclamation points, I have circles, I have like, oh, this reminds me of this. Like, mark the heck out of it. Interact with text. It's there to be interacted with. And if you're also still struggling, it's okay. Some poems are more difficult than others. I can't say that I can perfectly analyze every poem on the first try. No one really can. If you feel like you're still struggling, here's some of the tricks that you can follow. First, ask yourself what you think poetry should be or should do. For example, many people think that all poems rhyme, while other poems believe that a poem should be beautiful in its language. Is it possible that the poem you've chosen doesn't fit your beliefs? And if so, how does it do so and why? If the line breaks are making it difficult for you, try to write it into a prose paragraph. So remember that prose is just like everyday writing. So that's anything that's not a poem, really. So like how you'd write an essay, a novel, a short story. That can help make your sentences clearer, and it helps you become more aware of what's happening around the line breaks. I also want to note when you read the poem, you should not stop your thoughts at every line break. Your thoughts should only stop when you see a punctuation mark, like a comma, a period, a question mark, exclamation point, a dash. So if the line keeps flowing, you don't stop. For example, where it says, examine your beliefs about what poetry should be or do, I want to say, examine your beliefs about what poetry should be or do, right? That breaks up the idea. It doesn't make sense, so you just flow with it. And then remember that poetry demands skills of people that prose doesn't. Not every poem tells a story. Some are very associated, like associative, meaning it's making connections and allusions. Some are fragmented. So it's okay to look for connections that you wouldn't normally look for, or make connections that may seem weird. Purdue says you should read with your gut and your brain, because poetry is about the irrational. It is about the emotion, especially where we start in the Romantic period. So step one, in order to begin, you need to ask some basic questions to make sure you understand what the poet's project is. So what subjects or subject does the poem address? Who is the speaker of the poem? What is the poem's larger context? What genre or mode of the poem are you dealing with? Oops, too far. Sorry, guys. So it is, just remember, I think the biggest thing out of this is the narrator and the poet are not always the same. And a lot of times they're not the same at all. So don't assume that just because Miss Cochran wrote the poem, that Miss Cochran is the narrator. This is something that might help you. So if you know you're reading a lyric poem, that can be, these are things that are going to go with it. It's going to be associative. It's going to have vivid language. It's a narrative. We know it's telling a story. Dramatic, you know, it's going to have some narrative elements in it. An elegy is a lamenting or remembering. And then Ars Poetica is exploring writing as a subject. We don't see a lot of that in this class, at least not in a poem form. But the mode can affect our expectations of a poem and the conventions they use. And so knowing the format helps you understand, okay, since I'm writing an elegy or reading an elegy, I know this is going to be in remembrance of something or in lamenting about the loss. And that helps you understand where you're going. So step two is to examine the form and structure. So is it using a closed or knots form? So is it a set form or free form? What are the stanzas like? What are the devices being used? Negative versus positive space. So what that means is negative space would be where we have our writing, positive space, there's gaps. So how do they use empty spaces to frame their thoughts? You will see that a lot more in the modern writings. And then you can also look at, like, how's the poem put together itself? So that can be repetition, punctuation. So all of those matter. If there's a complete lack of punctuation, it's like a free flow. What does that tell us about the state of mind of the narrator versus having a perfect grammar? Positive space, oh, excuse me, I mixed it up earlier, but positive space is the text, negative space is the white space. So if I have extra white space around or negative space around a word, maybe I'm emphasizing it, I want the reader to pause. I'm trying to facilitate moving. So you really have to pay attention to the way it's written, but also the actual way it's written. So the words they use and the space it takes. Step three, look closely at line within the poem. So that means the meter, the lines. So the meter or the rhythm, how long are they? How do they vary? Is there a bunch of line breaks? Are there jammed or end stopped lines? This is dictated by form sometimes, but if we're in like a free form, it's not going to be, which tells us a lot about what they want us to do. So what you need to pay attention for is meter which is indicating a closed form, so like a Shakespearean sonnet. But if we're using a closed form, sometimes lines or sections will stand out because they're not matching perfectly. Places where rhythm, line, or language suddenly change means it's important, so pay attention. End stop lines are lines in which the end of a sentence coincides with the end of a poetic line. So an enjambed line means that the sentence continues on to the next one, so the sentence didn't finish before they broke it. It can be done at varying degrees. The more broken up it is, the choppier it's going to sound, which means it's going to slow you down, especially if you start pausing it at the end of every line. Don't do that. Okay, look for those places where form and lines are changing because that's going to be important. Step 4, look at the language the poet uses. What kind of diction does the poet use? What's the tone and mood? What images stand out? Why? Do they use figurative language? Okay, so I feel like diction is a little bit more familiar with you guys because by now you've gone through English 111 and 112. You should have talked about language and rhetoric some. So I don't want to spend a lot of time, but pay attention to it because it gives you clues. If it's, Latinate, so it's multisyllabic, is it colloquial, is it formal? And because the diction impacts your tone. So if I said emerald, her eyes are the color of emerald versus her eyes are the color of snot. That tells you a lot about how I feel about this lady with her green eyes. Tone then affects the mood of a poem. So she walked out into the black yawning night. She walked through the warm glittering night. Gives very different feelings. Black yawning, maybe it's tiring. If it's an open mouth yawning, is that ominous? Is she walking into the belly of the beast? She walked through the warm glittering night. That makes me think of summer when we've got a bunch of fireflies around, so it's a happier thought. An image can work as an important nexus of emotion and idea. So what's the tone of the image? Do they use a metaphor to alter the image or layer on other associations? What does the image embody? So again, just looking at the language and how they're using it. Remember that the job of the poet is to make something new. So they want to give something, a new, unheard of idea to this. Do they combine unexpected elements like form and subject? Does the poet employ an unusual perspective? How does the poet's language make something new or surprising? For example, in her poem Daddy, Sylvia Plath uses a nursery rhyme-like opening and overall rhythm to present very serious and often disturbing subject matter. This tension makes people want to keep reading. It's not what we expect. So if you're struggling with language, at least say, okay, this person's writing about an urn. What did they do to make this urn sound different like anything else I've read? You guys are going to be great with your poems. Don't worry. You can do it. I have faith, and I'm here to help you if you need it.